Welcome to the second of two screencasts looking at exam skills for the SY4 exam, and in this video we're going to focus on the second section of the SY4 paper, which is the section on World Sociology. Remember, you've got 2 hours in total for the SY4 exam, and I recommend that you spend about 70 minutes on the World Sociology section of this particular exam. What we can see on the screen at the moment is the layout for the World Sociology section of the exam. There will also be another topic underneath the World Sociology section that you just ignore. Okay, that's the other option for different schools and colleges that have delivered a different topic. You just ignore that. So you just look at the World Sociology section, and we can see that you've got a choice of question. Okay, you either do question 2 or question 3, and you have to do both bits of the question that you select. So either 2A and 2B or 3A and 3B. The 20-mark question is the most predictable section of the exam. So you're going to be asked on this question to outline and explain evidence that demonstrates some form of inequality. So either gender, class or ethnic inequalities in both the developed and the developing world. So you've got to pick 2 areas of life, one from poorer countries, so that's the developing world, and then the other different area of life that you've got to focus on is from the developed world, from richer countries such as our own. And the question normally specifies the type of inequality that you've got to discuss. So either gender, class or ethnic inequality, and you've got to make sure that you illustrate that type of inequality with reference to lots of really good sociological evidence from each area of life that you identify. The only other type of 20-mark question, in addition to those 3 that they might ask, is one that is much more open, where they just say where there is inequality. And in this type of question, you can choose what you want to focus on. So you can either focus on gender, class, or ethnicity. It's up to you which area you focus on. So for the 20-mark question, I recommend that you spend about 30 minutes on this section of the exam. And you need to begin by looking at the developing world, so poorer countries, and the area of life that I've given you notes on to help you write this question is on education. And if you've lost those notes, you can find them on iLearn in a document called How to Answer the 20-mark question. So you need to use that material to write 2 to 3 paragraphs describing and interpreting evidence of either class, gender or ethnic inequalities in education. And then you should also write an additional paragraph explaining how those inequalities in education might be connected to other forms of inequality that we find in developing countries. And of course, if you cannot read or write because you haven't had access to education, that's likely to negatively impact upon a whole range of other areas such as employment and health. Then you need to move on to look at the developed world, and the area of life that I've given you notes on is politics, and you need to write 2 to 3 paragraphs describing and interpreting evidence of class, gender or ethnic inequalities that we find within politics in developed countries, focusing particularly on the underrepresentation of certain social groups in key positions of political power, and then again write an additional paragraph explaining how those inequalities might be connected to other forms of inequality that we find within developed countries. So 15 minutes on this section of your answer, and then another 15 minutes on this section. And if you hit the pause button and have a look at the information on this slide, you can see how we might lay out an answer using the structure that I've just described if we were to get a question about class inequality. So this is an example of how you would answer this type of question. Now the 30-mark question is a slightly longer essay question purely on world sociology, and I recommend that you spend about 40 minutes of your time on this section of the exam. And the type of question that you will get will be one that requires you to demonstrate your understanding of issues of inequality with regard to global development. And more often than not, examiners tend to use this particular phrase in the questions. They talk about inequality in the developing world. And what they mean by this is, firstly, why has global development been so uneven? So why is it that some countries have managed to develop and become quite rich whilst other countries remain desperately poor? And then the other issue in terms of inequality is to look at the unfairness, to look at the inequalities that exist between groups within developing countries. For example, if we look at the position of women in most developing countries, their outcomes tend to be worse than they are for men. Now, questions that ask you to look at sociological explanations of inequalities in the developing world are really asking you to look at the theories that we considered during the World Sociology course. So, for example, modernisation theory argues that inequalities in the developing world are linked to where a country is on Rostow's ladder of social evolution. You remember that Walt Rostow talks about these 5 different evolutionary stages of economic growth. So the poor countries are less evolved or less developed than the rich countries that we find higher up this development ladder. And according to modernisation theory, these inequalities that we find between countries are largely the result of internal barriers that we find within developing countries, either economic barriers or cultural barriers. However, perhaps the most damaging criticism of modernisation theory is the accusation that it's an ethnocentric perspective. So this means it assumes that the kind of Western industrial consumer societies that we find in places like Western Europe and America are a superior form of society to other types of societies that we find in poorer regions of the world. And in taking this stance, this theory implies that the ways of life within developing countries are inferior and should be dispensed with at the soonest possible opportunity, and at the same time, whilst it devalues non-Western lifestyles and culture, it could be argued that this perspective romanticises the experience of people in developed countries, because these so-called modern societies, as we all know, are not bereft of problems with massive inequalities of their own. So, for example, in America, the richest 1% of the population have 40% of the wealth. Neoliberalism is another explanation that sees the inequalities faced by developing countries to be primarily a result of internal factors. And in particular, this perspective argues that corruption and economic mismanagement are the key factors that cause many poor countries to lag behind the richer industrialised nations. And this perspective argues that aid actually hinders development as it props up corrupt regimes and inefficient producers. And advocates of this perspective would argue that the best long-term solution to the inequalities faced by poorer countries in the developing world is for them to adopt free trade policies by removing trade barriers and reducing the role of the state in the management of the economy. However, critics of this perspective argue that the free trade policies advocated by neoliberals have increased rather than decreased inequalities. For example, producers in developing countries are thrown unprotected into the turbulent global market as a result of free trade policies, and they can't really compete against Western businesses who are much stronger. So they quickly collapse, or they're swallowed up by giant transnational corporations, so they don't really stand a chance. Dependency theory and world systems theory focus much more on the external causes of inequalities in the developing world rather than looking at the internal barriers. For example, these perspectives argue that the inequalities that we find have been created by the exploitation of the poor world by rich countries, and that poor countries will only be able to overcome these inequalities if they de-link themselves from the capitalist world system. So from this perspective, the inequalities experienced in the developing world have been caused by things like colonialism, which involved rich countries forcibly taking control and stealing the resources of the people in Africa, Asia, and the Americas. However, critics of this perspective argue that this explanation perhaps places too much emphasis on the impact of colonialism on inequalities in the developing world, and that as a consequence this perspective finds it difficult to explain why some former colonies have experienced economic growth and increasing international power over the last few years. Most notably the cases of countries like India, Brazil, and the so-called Asia tiger economies. Now, whereas the primary focus of most explanations is on economic inequality, the counter-industrial theories remind us that we shouldn't measure inequality purely in economic terms. So advocates of these approaches argue that we also need to focus much more closely on environmental and social inequalities. For example, poorer countries have less capacity to mitigate the impact of climate change, which of course is a problem that has been primarily caused by Western industrial capitalist nations. So this perspective argues that the development policies used to tackle inequalities in the developing world need to be environmentally and socially sustainable. In other words, improvements should not compromise the ability of future generations to support themselves. Now, the pattern for most past examination questions is that normally one of the 30-mark questions is on a specific topic, so in this case the topic is aid, and then the other 30-mark question is a theory question, and that will either be a question that asks you to evaluate a particular theory, so in this case the specific theory that you need to evaluate is dependency theory, or it will be a more general question where you've got to evaluate a range of theories. And these questions tend to be phrased using this particular term. Sociological explanations means looking at a range of different theoretical approaches. For questions about topics, so for questions about the role of aid, for example, normally you'll be asked to evaluate a claim. So in the previous question, the claim was that aid cannot solve the problems of the developing world, and you need to use this four-part essay structure to help you plan an effective answer for this type of question. So we've looked at this with our work on politics, and remember a very good way of making sure that you get lots of marks is to make sure that your paragraphs in section 2 and 3 of your answer follow this peel structure. So on this slide we can see a paragraph on counter-industrial theory that we could use to help us evaluate the claim that aid cannot solve the problems of the developing world. So if you hit the pause button and you read through this answer, and you should see that we've got a clear identification the point that this paragraph is going to make, the fact that we're going to use counter-industrial theory to look at some of the advantages of aid. That's then developed and explained with reference to some real examples, so with reference to the work of practical action. It's clearly linked back to the question, so this is the linked sentence, and then we've got a sentence or two at the end of the paragraph with some criticisms of these particular arguments. So this is the evaluation part of the paragraph. And here's another paragraph for the same type of essay, but this time using the neoliberal perspective that was written by a group in an A2 class this year. And again, it's a really good example of this pill approach. So we've got the point that the paragraph is trying to make. That point is explained, it's linked to some sociological evidence, there's a clear and explicit link back to the question, and also there's some evaluation at the end. So a really good paragraph. And this is the structure that you would adopt if you get a question asking you to evaluate a specific theory. And remember that with this type of question, the longest section of your answer needs to be section 4, where you look at the strengths and weaknesses of the perspective. And this is where you can draw upon other theories to help you criticise and challenge the theory that's mentioned in the question. And then finally, this is the structure that I would suggest that you adopt if you get a question not just on one theory, but a question that asks you to evaluate sociological explanations, which means a range of theories. And finally, remember that there are lots of really good resources on iLearn to help you revise the content and really hone your examination skills. So you've got links to all of the screencasts, you've got glossaries of key terms, revision notes, model answers, lots of really good stuff to help you. So best of luck with the SY4 exam.